So essentially, the Friedrich Rebbe's question is min ha'mitzar korosiko, out of the constraints, the straits. Korosi, I simply call out to you. I don't supplicate. I don't cry. I don't tzaikozum, two expressions of crying. Just a casual, as it were, easy call. That's the Friedrich Rebbe's question. The Rebbe's question is, how is it possible that after the whole avodah of Elul and of Erev Rosh Hashanah by night, and Rosh Hashanah in the morning, just before Tkiyas, a Yid is still in a state of Mitzar? How is that possible? And it cannot be that he makes himself that way. As Rashi's words are that any year that's Reishis, the Torah spells without an aleph hinting to Roshis, which means poor, impoverished, at its beginning will have a future, be rich in the end. Rashi explains it to me. They didn't make themselves poor and supplicate God like a poor person. It cannot be that this is just assuming some kind of role, but not bepnimius and not deeply true. So how is it that in such a matzah, before Tkiyah Shofar, a Jew is in min ha'mitzar? He calls him a constraint, a narrow place, a constriction. Lahavin ze Oz Gimel. Now begin the answer. Lahavin ze yesh lahatrin tchila hamavu b'mayim haranal. So we're going to first preface that which it says in that Maimer. This is the Maimer of the Friedrich Rebbe. Be'inyan tefillah sa'oni. Until we find the prayer of the Oni, capital Kuf base, which begins tefillah la'oni kiyata, if the prayer of the poor person, kiyata, when he enwraps himself in the talis. It's a simple meaning. Lefnei havaya yishpech sichre, before God, he pours out his conversation. His conversation. Now, shesicha yoloshen taruma is, he says actually sicha is more than a conversation, which just means, it's a chatting for social purposes. It actually means taruma is a complaint. There's a complaint being lodged here. What's the complaint the poor person has to the Almighty? Sheyesh loni tarumas ala kadosh baruch hu. The poor have a complaint before the Holy One, blessed be He, and that is lama tzarech hu lizbel tzar v'yisurim b'kabolas panasasa meha oshet. Why does he have to suffer the pain? What does he have to bear? The pain and the suffering in having to receive his panasa from the wealthy person. Why did you put me in this position? And explains the Friedrich Rebbe, the truth is, why does God do it? There's a very deep intent for why God created the world such that there are poor people. Because so it's established above the whole Seder Ishtalshalos, at every step of the chain of worlds, of the divine manifestation, of the divine system. It all works at every stage. There's a giver and a receiver. And he traces it back from the bottom up. Starting at Atzilus, it's a pretty lofty level. So Atzilus, there's Zun, there's Zon Nukva, the male attributes, and Nukva, Malchus. The 6 attributes, Zeran, literally small faces, Mashpia, that's the Mashpia. Malchus, and Makabel, the recipient. That's Atzilus. That's the midas of Atzilus. Even higher in Atzilus, Chochma Bina, Gamkim, Derech Mashpia, Makabel, there too, it's Mashpia, Makabel, Shechochma, the Kras of Chochma is the father, the seed, Shebrichas Mashpia, the Bina, that gives to Bina Shnikras Ein, what's called mother, B'chinas Makabel, the recipient. That's Bina that develops the Nekuda. That's the parallel in the Nefesh Odom. But Lamaila, these are Madregas of Mashpia Makabel, and even beyond that Silis and Keser. There too are the two is the dynamic of give and receive. So there's the atik, which is the pinimis of Keser, which means literally removed, and it means ancient, and that means long, it's referring to long or big face, as opposed to the small faces of the smaller revelations in Atzilus. So this is arich anpin, shehem bepchinas mashpia. There, atik is the mashpia, umakabel, the recipient is arich anpin. Moreover, probing even deeper vegan, shegam b'chinas atik yeshni da mashpia makabel. Even in atik, there's mashpia makabel atik. This is Beit Chaim, as it says in Yitzchayim. Shebchinas atik, that the level of atik, kol atzmus yinaseh, mishnei b'chinas elu ma'o ban. Even atik itself emerges from two levels that perceive it, and that's ma and ban. What's ma or ban? These are different numerical values of Shem Havaya, right? The Yud Ke Vav Ke yields 4 classic different numerical values depending on how it's spelled out. The Yud is always spelled the same. Yud Vav Dalet, that's a constant, but the Hey can be spelled Hey, can be spelled Hey Aleph, can be spelled Hey Yud. So it yields different gematria. So Shema and Shemban. So Shema is when the filler letter is Aleph, and Shemban is when the filler letter is a Hey. So Ma Shebayu B'chinas Atik Deduchra. Ma is the male dimension of Atik, or Ban. We don't have to go into that. Just get the idea. And Shemban, who B'chinas Nukva Atik Shemban, where the filler letters are Hey. So that is the female dimension of Atik. So there too, within Atik itself, there's the dynamic of Mashpia Mekabel. These two divine names, Shema and Shemban, Mashpia Mekabel. Moreover, v'yiseidim izeh shegam klolos hamshachas hakav ma'erin. So the very loftiest level of the emergence of the first projection of the divine light from the Eidin Sof that comes, that is rooted where shelifnei tzimtzum, before the tzimtzum, higher than the tzimtzum. That's where the light emerges that projects into post tzimtzum, into the mokem chol, into the quote unquote vacuum. So that too is a hashpa to a recipient. And even higher, even lofty, from the luminary to the light, that too is mashpia makabel, the luminary, the level of luminary, which is essential before the light emerges. It's potential for revelation, and even higher than that. So that's mo'er, so that's the mashpia, and then the that emerges is the recipient, is the result. So it traces this whole dynamic of mashpia makabel. It's a binary system, goes back all the way. It's yes, no. The whole existence, the whole computer, everything is at every step. It's yes and no, on off, mashpia makabel. Why? Because that's how it is l'mayla. That's how God chose to manifest. He chose to manifest Himself in this system, and the system is mashpia makabel. As explained, the elsewhere. We talk about the unification of the Holy One Bespi and His Shechina. That too, obviously. So where this is addressed, it's all explained that it's all Mashpia Makabel, Seviv Kalam, and Malakalam, infinite and finite, transcendent and immanent. This union of Kutsha Bricha Shechinte, Seviv Mamala. Yes, Nagam Difnei Tzimtzum is also before the Tzimtzum. Usually, actually, we say the Mamala Kalalmi is a product of the Tzimtzum. But there's the Inyan of Seviv Mamala, the transcendent and the filling light, even Lifnei Tzimtzum. Showing, we get the general idea. Well, the poor fellow down here is just a reflection of that whole divine system. That since the whole thing is a way of mashpia makabel, a giver and a receiver, therefore there has to be the same system of mashpia and makabel gamlamat also down here. And what's that? Sheseo inyan, the oshivani, the haves and the have-nots, the wealthy and the poor. No, but the poor person still has a taina. Lifnei Hashem yishpach sicha. Hinei emes takatru shemuchlech sheyaniem. Okay, that's your decision, dear God. You have to have givers and receivers. But the poor fellow says, as Tevye said, did you know that Tevye learned? Kabbalah and Chassidus. The poor person can have a taina. There's more than a taina. It's like he's really indignant. Why does me she only? So why you have to be the poor man? As Tevye said, would it disturb some vast eternal plan if I was a rich man? If I was a rich, right? Why can't the rich person be the oni? Why can't it be the other way? And the question is even stronger. We see we see many poor people. They're not nice and not better people than the wealthy people. Not only because they have sacrificed, because they lack and they're still committed and they're still. Even in the irrational avodah, in other words, in their personalities and their the kind of people that they are, and the avodah pitam v'das, they're nicer people, not just having more sacrifice and more devoted. We see there are many that are nicer. We have began nonetheless. They have to be received from the Ashirim. The Rebbe concludes, and since his cry is very great, and his taina is strong and justified, his poverty, it's not his fault. It's your fault. You established this in Seder Shtalshalis. That's why his tefillah comes first, has precedence, even over the tefillah of everybody else. And he concludes because of the constraint that he's in, min ha'mitzar, and he says, this constraint you've placed me in, he touches God on a much higher level than the one who has. Doesn't elaborate, but we get the sense. I think we'll have a deeper understanding. But
he elaborates in the Sitha.
See in the Sikha.
Ha'ara 25.
You learned it?
No, I'm just looking at the footnote.
Okay, well, look at that Sikha Mitzvah. Or we'll look at that Sikha, yeah. Okay. We can look at it now if you want, and I'll just share it with you. Want to do that? Because I leave for Australia on. We leave.
One minute. I'll let me go get it.
The next year is going to be Tuesday, God willing. We arrive Tuesday morning in Australia, and Tuesday night will be Tuesday morning here. Should I get it? You're the president. You decide, Chaim. Or
I'm going to get it right now.
What?
I'm going to get it.
Not going to help us. Are you going to share it then? Okay, so look it up and share it with us. Me, we'll go ahead. Daled. Now that which we now explained, that the poor person, his complaint before God. It's why is he complaining? Why must I be the Makabel? Nimtza. So now it comes out, in light of what we pointed out before, that this dynamic of Mashpia Mekabel exists even lifnei HaTzimtzum. Nimtza, it comes out. This poor man's prayer exists on every level. The Mashpia Mekabel exists, and that's right from the get-go, explained at length. So we're getting a sense of our answer, how we can possibly say Min Hameitzar now before Tkiyah Shofar. So since that this inyan exists even before the Tzimtzum HaRimuv and sheyesh gam chilukei dargis being a Meitzer, obviously it's all relative, the different levels in Meitzer Aniyas and this poverty and this impoverishment. Relative to a higher level, he's in a Meitzer. Relative to a low level, he's merchav. He's broad and expansive. Relative to a higher level, that which it experienced till now is a state of expansiveness and broadness. Relative to the higher levels of Mashpia, who is in a state of Meitzer. So the operative word here is, it is relative, and relative, that relativity begins at the highest levels of the divine expression. So now we get to answer Mizem Wuvo and Shekenu Gambing the Minametza Korasiko. So likewise, in the Yid calls out Minametza Shemri, but Hashanah couldn't Tkiyah Shofar. The Yid says before Tkiyah Shofar. Room is gone by Shofar Atzma. This idea of the Mitzar and the Merchav is alluded to in the very physical Shofar itself. That one end is narrow, but the other is broad, and you have to blow from the narrow side to the broad side. That is reflected, it says in the Zohar, of this very pasuk min Hameitzar korasiko anoni b'merchavko, from the constraint I call to God, and God answers me with expansiveness, from the narrow end of the shofar to the broad end of the shofar. Sheyesh chilukei dargis min Hameitzar, the shofar, there's many levels in this constraint of the shofar. There's different levels of shofar. And the matter is as follows: there's only one shofar. No, there isn't. The pasuk says, we say this, of course, in Shofar, it's Rosh Hashanah, in the third section of Tfilas Musaf. So we conclude with, on that day, Yitok Abba Shofar Gadol, the great Shofar will be sounded. Those who are lost in the land of Asher and so will come back, and those who are pushed away in the land of Mitzrayim will all come back. Vishtach Val Hashem, and bow before God, Bahar HaKodesh Yerushalayim, on the holy mountain Yerushalayim. So all that's going to be as a result of the sound of the great shofar. Now, if you say a great shofar, you're already implying that there's an ordinary shofar. Sheyesh beis b'chinas shofar, this implicit here is that there's two levels of shofar. The shofar stam, the classic shofar, it's Rosh Hashanah. And then the shofar Gadol, the great shofar, the Lasid Lavai, that is sounded. The Rebbe said that the great shofar began to sound when 1967 war, 6-day war. That's when the greatest Oyrus of Tshuva began all over the world, and the shofar continues to sound. It has not stopped. So that's the great shofar of Lasid Lavai that culminates in Mashiach's coming. So there's two shofars. And yet even the great shofar has a narrow end and a broad end. And the Gamar shofar Gadol, even the great shofar has one end is narrow and the other broad. Like the classic shofar. How do we know this? Maybe not. So Kimuvim Maimar Azal, it's understood from the Maimar Azal, the Gemara says, in the Medrash says, being in Eile Shel Yitzchak, with regard to the ram of Yitzchak, the Akedah, story of which we tell in the Rosh Hashanah. And we invoke the Akedah in Zichroinus, in the middle section of the Musaf. So the Medrash says that the horn has So that the potato says it got caught in the brush, in the thorns, by thorns. So it says the Medrash, they karnav shel ayil, a ram has two horns. Shel smoil, so the left horn, the left shofar of this ayil, nishma kel al Har Sinai, it was sounded when on Har Sinai by Matan Torah. Shofar the Matan Torah, the shofar Matan Torah, shekoshim gam mashev Rosh Hashanah, which is connected to the shofar of Rosh Hashanah. Shalachin maskirim ze bepsuki shofar Rosh Hashanah. When we talk about shofar, the third section of the Musaf, the psukim of shofars, we talk about the shofar of Matan Torah. And it's also understood the connection between the shofar of Matan Torah and Rosh Hashanah. Not only because we quote it in the Tefillah, but it's also understood on the deeper level in Masha Kosev Aravagon HaChosid. It's interesting, Aravagon. I wonder if the Rebbe said that. Rabbi Kodesh Aravagon, it's interesting. HaChosid, he was a God, obviously, but I don't know why you see it like that. Because the famous Moshel, you know, Tzkiya Shofar. But Beer, Moshel, Tzkiya Shofar, Meliovאוויטש, Halavushim. So the Bekitzer, the story is that a king was lost in the forest. And he couldn't find his way out back to the palace. And there was one fellow there that he recognized that this is the king. No one even knew that he was the king. And he showed him how to get back to the forest. No one else even realized he was the king, was even interested in his plight. And certainly no one knew the way back to the palace. But this person did. As a result of this, he took him with him, the king, and he elevated him, became a very exalted position in the palace. And one day he sinned. And it was a grievous offense. And the consequence, the ultimate. So on trial, he had one request. The king said, go ahead. Which is often the case, that the final request is granted to the condemned. He'd already been condemned. Guilty as charged. His request was that he wants to be in the same clothing, and the king should be in the same clothing that he as a forester, and the king as a hunter in the forest, when they first met. The king granted it, and then of course it brought back that moment, and he pardoned him and restored him to his former position, and even greater still. And that's the whole Matan Torah. Hashem went around, is lost. Who wants my Torah? Nobody wants the Torah. And the Yidden said, we will accept your Torah. And we accepted the Torah, and therefore, even after we've sinned, we, quote unquote, remind God. And I'm going to talk about this in the next year. What does it mean to remind God? What this whole Zechariah's business? God forgets, means beyond the whole notion of. So we'll talk about that Be'ez Hashem in the next year, 6:30. But at any rate, so that's the Baditchev says, so the blowing of the shofar, that's putting on that garment again. That's the reenactment, quote unquote, of accepting the Torah at Sinai, where this fellow recognizes the king and guides him back to the palace. So the Rebbe is saying, we see even more from the Baditchev's Moshel. Let's read it inside, the connection between what? The shofar of Matan Torah and Rosh Hashanah. And yet, he's going to conclude, this is just the other, not just, but it's the other horn of, this is one horn, and the other horn is Lasid Lovia Mashiach, so it conforms with the same waist. It's the two horns of the same animal, so both have the narrow and the broad. And even the shofar Godel has a narrow. That's where he's going with all this. But along the way, he's threading in detail and depth about the shofar of Rosh Hashanah, which is connected to the shofar of Matan Torah, which is why we quote it, and especially according to the Baditchev's explanation. Let's read it inside. The summary of the Moshel, the Moshel is wearing the same garments, at the time that they both of them, both the the fellow in the forest and the king wore when he led the king back from the forest to the palace. Says the Baditchev, that's when we blow the shofar. That's the garments. The shofar is the garment of Matan Torah, which the Torah itself says there was a sound of the great shofar. The Yidden accepted in the Tevim Bluchas, and they coronated God. They accepted him as their king. Matan Torah was a kind of Rosh Hashanah, accepting God as our king. So that's all the left. That's the left horn. That's the term for it. It's a horn. Yeah, Keren. That's the left horn of the shofar of Yitzchak's ayil. The Keren shel Yamin. So the right one means it's the similar to say all of Nitkoyim Beilas will be blown and is being blown. This was 1966, friends. The Rebbe says the next year, 67 war. That's when it started. And in fact, he said a maimet, Rosh Hashanah Tavshin Chavches, Muga, we learned it. Oh, Yabayahu begins with these words. Which we learned, friends.
5 Maimarim V'haya B'yemahu that year.
What's that?
There were 5 Maimarim V'haya B'yemahu that year.
Right. Yeah. But only the first was Muga. But he continued all the way to Shabbos Bereshis. All the way. We learned it, friends. We learned them, I think, even. Yeah. If you'd remember a little bit what we learned, we'd be in a fine position, eh? Like they ever told Aaron Lazer, not just memorize it here, but here. Keep it in the pocket of your heart. Okay, so V'keren shel Yamin, see this guy, that's going to be blown in the future. We talk about Shofar Gadol. On that day, the great shofar will be sounded. V'kiven, now wrapping up the point. Since these two shofars, the ordinary, the classic one, which is the Rosh Hashanah one, the Matan Torah one, and the Shofar Gadol, the great one, which is heralds Mashiach, Heim Shtei Karnav Shal Eli Shal Yitzchak, they're the two horns of the ram of Yitzchak, Arim Buven. It's understood, Shem Kshurim V'Shayach Mzelazeh, they're connected, and they're related, Shneim B'Isa Ofen, and they're both of the same form. Shetzidam Bechet Kotzer, one end is narrow and the other is broad, so therefore the inyan of Min Hameitzar even is in the Shofar Gadol that heralds Mashiach's come. Even the Shofar Gadol has this min Hameitzar from the constraints. Ella, it's relative. The Shofar Gadol, it's infinitely greater, this constraint of the great Shofar, than the broadness of the ordinary Shofar. But it's still relative to what it elicits, to the mashpia that it elicits, that it summons, it's a constraint. So we started to get our answer. Ever deepening in the Hameitzar Karosika that a Jew says even after the Avodah of Elul, the Avodah of Rosh Hashanah night, and the Avodah of Rosh Hashanah before davening, the Avodah of davening. It's Min Hameitzar. Okay, Chaim, did you have anything there for us?
I posted it on the chat.
Oh, we want to share it. So let me have a look.
So open the chat.
How long is the Sikha?
I just posted 2 pages.
Okay, let's quickly look at it. Jeff, good morning. So let's have a look. Where you see this on the chat? Oh, now it's a whole story now. It's upside down. Now you're asking me to do acrobatics. Okay, let's see if it's going to work. Which sikha? The second sikha. Yeah. Let's have a look at it. No, but there's more. Okay, let me share with you.
I sent 2 pages.
Yeah, but it continues.
It's only a page and a half, the whole thing.
Okay, God willing. Okay, friends, Be'ez Hashem, we will share this on Tuesday. That'll be the next year. Mitzvah Hashem, Tuesday, Zoom only.